Hello, everyone. I'm Tommaso Valletti. I'm the director of the CEPR RPN on competition policy. I'm very grateful to CEPR for hosting us today. We're going to have a great panel on Acquihires, but we're going to have also a fireside chat between Cristina Caffarra and Jonathan Cantor. So the RPN of CEPR on competition policy is really, I should say, the leading platform for the discussion between enforcers and academics about competition policy issues, the most relevant today. And today is indeed one of those events where we are having people from both sides of the Atlantic. We have got current enforcer, former enforcers, academics who have contributed with seminal work on the topic of Acquihire. So I just want to say that the meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on social media. There will not be a possibility to take questions from the audience, but you can, put your comments in the chat if you want, and we'll be happy to have a look at them as we go through, and if not, at least later on. So without further ado, I welcome everybody to this event that will last for 90 minutes, and I'll pass the baton to Cristina, who will introduce our main guest, Jonathan Cantor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tommaso, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As you said, before we get into the swing of the panel, which is on Acquihires, I have really the pleasure of welcoming Jonathan Cantor, well known to you all, the former Associate Attorney General of the DOJ, who actually did write on Acquihires recently in an op-ed in the Financial Times. And we'll get to that, but we want to take advantage of the unique opportunity of having Jonathan online to start with a broader conversation on antitrust, where we are and where we are going, really, given his recent tenure. So we're not certainly going to do a retrospective of your achievement, Jonathan, which are many. Of course, many major challenges you won, Google search trial, where Google was found to be a monopolist, many, many more. I want to talk about the present and the future, very much based on your recent experience. So I think a place to start is we're not in continuity mode, are we? At least in the United States. So we were all fascinated by the push under the Biden administration towards an anti-monopoly lens through which to see many areas of policy. I think that was a contribution that fascinated many of us, because anti-monopoly became indeed the lens through which multiple areas of policy, from trade to industrial policy to agriculture to transport, was going to be seen, and the whole of government approach was very much in that spirit. Now we have a new geoeconomics era. We don't need to discuss the details of that, but certainly we have a new US administration that calls itself populist, says it is putting also ordinary Americans first. We see tariffs being wielded to reshore manufacturing, allegedly, fighting immigration, fighting culture wars, and in a very different relationship with the world of oligarchics, Wall Street, media barons, and so on. When it comes to antitrust, the impression is clearly that it is being somewhat dialed down, shall we say. The expression that is being used is, we want to wield a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I've heard that repeatedly. And we see all that is going on, the firing of Roger Alford, etc. We're not going to comment on that, but the scope seems to be much narrower than the vision that you were basically pursuing during your tenure. But it's not also as simple as, oh, well, they're doing something sort of less and something different. I mean, I think there is a big question about what is the real reach of the tool, of the antitrust tool. Isn't it time that we reflect on that? Because, of course, you pursued a particular vision. We are now in a different time. And when you take a step back, we know that the tool is hampered to some extent by its narrowness, by the fact that it takes forever. Look at the recent Google search outcome, and so on. So it takes 10 years to get anywhere. So I would like to start with this, apologies for the long introduction, to really get your thoughts, given the background of the experience you had, but also looking at the present and the future, about what do you think the role is that antitrust can and will play going forward? And what is your pitch for what the vision should be, having had the opportunity to reflect? Thank you.
So yeah, my view is that we're at a crossroads, and that crossroads is, you know, is, for antitrust, but really for what kind of economy and what kind of world do we want to live in. When we were, talking about reviving antitrust law, we were talking about it against the backdrop of, at least here in the United States, the latter years of the New Deal era economic and government framework. We were reviving a tool that had been diminished in during the kind of neoliberal post 1980s economic order, and we were optimizing for that. I think the world is shifting for sure. Industrial policy is on the rise, populism's on the rise, distrust of capitalism is on the rise. And so, how you think about anti-monopoly antitrust has to be discussed in context. That having been said, I still firmly believe that a competitive economy is desirable. And whether you optimize for domestic competition versus global competition is a separate question. But I would much rather have decentralization of corporate power in any environment, because otherwise you're risking, in my view, a authoritarian regimes, private regulation, and all the negative consequences that flow from that. In terms of what role antitrust can play, let me just try to give you a little bit of context, because it's easy to look at the big cases and the big litigations and say they were slow, and they were. Although we tried to rectify some of that by using the rocket docket and some other things, but we were also restoring something that had been on life support for decades. And so it takes time to revive and then get the patient back to full health. That having been said, there are areas where the effect was immediate. And so I would think probably the most impactful part of our time is I remember my first set of remarks that I gave. I announced that we were going to change our policy on merger remedies. Simply by adjusting the policy on merger remedies, it changed the risk profile of mergers at large. And we saw fewer problematic mergers being proposed in the first instance, simply because we didn't have this easy escape hatch with divestitures and remedies and the scalpel approach. And so in terms of deterring concentration, those kinds of policy decisions that are enforcement oriented can have a very significant effect if you're thoughtful about how you use them.
Challenge you a little bit on both of these points, enforcement and mergers. Yes, of course, there is perhaps a bias towards looking at the big sort of flagship cases that take forever, but there's been associated with the movement, with the Brandisian movement, the progressive movement, a vision that we should wield antitrust to ultimately disperse monopoly power, disperse concentrated power. And what we are seeing, you had a very brief time, Lina had a brief time. In Europe, we have been enforcing against platforms for a long time. It doesn't work in the sense of dispersing power. Does it have even the potential of doing so? Where do you see it? Even if we do a breakup of a DEX, say, is that going to really bite into the power of these monopolies, or are we just kind of doing things that are relatively well-meaning but marginal?
Well, I think, listen, what is the alternative, right, is what I would say. And so this is not unlike a conversation that was taking place 100 years ago in the United States, which is, do we want to let the economy consolidate and concentrate and then impose regulations, which is ultimately where Teddy Roosevelt came out? Or would we rather have regulate competition and then let the market try to sort out some of those issues and then use regulation as necessary to deal with market failures, safety, security, and the like? And that's really more of the Brandeis point of view. I subscribe to the latter. I would rather see a decentralized economy. I would rather try to use antitrust to the greatest extent possible, recognizing that it is not a panacea and is not going to solve every problem, and then giving markets at least the chance to sort these issues out. As I said before, it's not a switch that you can flip on and off overnight. And so when we were thinking about reviving antitrust, we were thinking about whole of government. We were thinking about policies. We were thinking about bringing transformational cases that would change the law and force it to shift, much the way the Bork era did. In hindsight, it looks like they changed things quickly, but at the time, it felt slow. It took 10 or 15 years to really change the face of antitrust law. It'll take a 10 or 15 years to change it back if you're fully committed to doing so. So these things in real time seem slow. In hindsight, are probably pretty fast. But to your kind of more broader existential question, Christine, I would say I think I would not give up on a competitive economy as being desirable, and I would use antitrust tools and revive those tools to the greatest extent possible to maximize that competition. And then to the extent that you need regulation to address market failures, safety, security, or other things that are beyond the reach of antitrust, then you can do so. But I would caution, because regulation, while not necessarily bad, comes with its own set of challenges. Capture being one of them, stagnation being another, and the ability of regulators to keep pace. So I don't necessarily, I think there are many areas, in particular relating to technology and AI, where we do need regulation. We need some lines on the road. We need some traffic lights and some stop signs to make sure that people can travel safely, whether those people are children using the AI or businesses. But I would not give up on competition as a core value, and I would not give up on antitrust as a important tool to promoting competition, even if it's not a perfect tool and even if it's not the only tool.
Yes, I ask myself the existential question a lot, but I do agree one shouldn't give up. But as you touch on regulation, of course, you're talking to an audience with many Europeans, and you do express the view that it's not a prohibited path or a forbidden path for you to take, but it is, we see that there is no appetite for it in the US very much. And Europe, on the other hand, has taken...
Can I disagree with that? I think there's a strong
disagree.
appetite for it. There's just no mechanism to execute it, right? And so there's a great deal of support for it in public. There's a great deal of support for it in Congress. In fact, we've had bills that have been voted out. I mean, we live in an political environment here. I'm in Washington, where Republicans and Democrats can't agree on anything, except they agree that we probably need to do something with respect to privacy and AI. What we have is a political system that's broken, and that political system has points of failure that make it very easy for a small minority, particularly well financed minorities and tech companies in particular, to kill legislation that is widely popular, both politically and in terms of the the public. So my view is that there is support for it. It's just a failure of our political system to implement and execute on that support.
Yeah, I stand corrected. When I say there is no appetite, I didn't mean there is no broad appetite. I mean, I, like you, don't see a path realistically through which things can politically be adopted, right? Maybe that is too negative, but you've also witnessed, however, the efforts that Europe is making. You've witnessed it from afar on regulation. And my own judgment is not particularly favorable to that effort, because I don't think we're achieving very much. What is your view on this?
My view is, listen, my view is I'm an American, right? And I believe that sovereign nations and communities have the ability to impose laws, and And I respect that process. And I don't view it as a trade barrier when Europe or somebody else wants to impose basic rules and regulations. I view that as governance. And they make their decisions on governance. We make our decisions on governance, and we can agree or disagree. After we got to a point in the world where any sort of law or any sort of rule was seen as regulatory and bad. And again, I go back to the rise of the automobile, right? If we had a world where you didn't have lanes and stop signs and traffic lights, not only would it be unsafe, but it would be bad for business because your delivery couldn't get to your door because it'd be running into folks on the roads. Like as a society, we need some degree of order, some degree of fundamental safety, a system that works. And it may take time to get it right and wrong. There may need to be some trial and error to figure out where that balance is. And one of my thesis is that what we need to do is we need to reinvent the way government approaches those issues and its knowledge base. We, for too long, relied on theorists rather than folks with technical understanding. And so, we're in an audience of economists, and but I think that we were too dependent on theoretical models, and we lost our connection to the actual facts on the ground, how the stuff works. And so I think that it's imperative that government or agencies, legislators, and others develop the foundational knowledge that they need to really understand how to develop those traffic lights and stop signs and lanes so that we can do this right. But when the tools aren't used, or the muscles aren't used, they atrophy. And whether it's antitrust or regulation, we have a bunch of weak muscles that we need to start exercising and get better. So it's going to take time. It's going to take some trial and error. But I think we have to try. And I think if we're afraid to try, then we'll go nowhere.
This is very much something I subscribe to, but how are we going to make progress in the sense that, at the moment, for example, under the current administration, regulation is described like a sledgehammer and totally undesirable. You talked about mergers and the way in which you changed the exact expectation about mergers by changing remedies. Well, we slid back into a world in which behavioral remedies are mostly the norm. So, there is a reversal right now, which makes it's inevitable in the American system that this is the way things work, but doesn't make one very clear about what the path forward is going to be.
The path forward is jagged. And so that's, I think we can revert right back to where we were. I don't think that's useful. And I don't think that's workable because the public is moving on, right? Going back to the beginning of our conversation, the backdrop for this conversation today is very different than the backdrop of this conversation 10 years ago. And Christina and I have been having it for 10 years or longer, right? That was the backdrop for that conversation was restore competition as a core value. How do we restore the connection between competition and democracy as a core value against the backdrop of a neoliberal economic order? I think today we're still having the same conversation about how do we restore competition as a core value, how to restore competition as an important ingredient of democracy against the backdrop of an emerging geopolitical climate of industrial policy and populism. And so while the value is the same, the context and the theater for the discussion has changed dramatically. And so, it makes it interesting, but it also means that we, shouldn't go back to, where we were because the world's moved on.
So we could talk for a long time, and I enjoy talking to you forever. I want us to move a little further to give space to the panel, and as a segue, perhaps to pick up the analysis and the statement you made in your recent article in the Financial Times, in the discussion around how one deals with tech monopolies, if you like, tech companies. Acquihires have taken some space, because of course the question there is whether what we are seeing is a form of perhaps circumvention, given the way in which antitrust has been enforced more vigorously in the recent past against mergers involving large platforms. So you wrote in your op-ed that you were concerned that these kind of acquisitions that we were seeing, and this is the main theme of the panel, were a way of effectively going around scrutiny and trying to effectively achieve a merger by another name. Will you expand a little bit on that and give the view that you set out there?
Sure. It's to me, it's self-evident. You can acquire if the core value of a company is its people, right? If we are in a world where the intellectual human capital is a core asset, and you acquire that core asset, it's no different than acquiring all the factories of a company or all the contracts of a company. And it's to me, it is self-evident that it is no different than a merger. And if we elevate form over substance, then we lose the opportunity to have any meaningful impact. So if antitrust and competition policy, whether it's enforcement, regulation, or anything else, is going to be effective, meaningful, at all relevant, it has to be attuned to the realities of how markets function. And if we talked about this, for example, during my tenure in the context of private equity. Private equity, you can say it's good, bad, or otherwise. You can be completely neutral. It is a fact of life that private equity firms acquire assets and roll them up. And so it would be irresponsible for us not to understand or appreciate that market reality then when assessing whether acquisitions are problematic. It would be irresponsible for government enforcers to look at acquihires and treat them differently than an acquisition if if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's not a fish.
Pick up before handing over to the panel, though, on a question that's come up in the panel in the Q&A, which I was going to ask anyway as a devil's advocate question. A number of people out there are writing to the effect or are stating that, oh, but AI is different. You can't look at AI in the same way as you look at the traditional tech monopolies, because the economics is different, because they're on the same network effects, they're on the same whatever. I've seen a number of these kind of consultancy, mostly reports stating this. But there is a sort of a narrative out there that says, oh, no, you shouldn't be worried about AI in the same way as you should have worried about the old mergers we didn't enforce against, the WhatsApp and so on. What's your response to that?
That's exactly the same story we heard 20 years ago with respect to the internet. And that theory of the world failed miserably. We should be more concerned, not less. The tendency toward tipping and network effects makes the problems worse. The tendency toward monopoly and integration and the impact on privacy and security and the control over the flow of information and its influence on society and the free flow of ideas and informed citizenry are greater in the context of AI. I mean, the impact on labor is greater. All of the problems that we think about in the context of antitrust and competition as a tool and an important value are amplified by a factor of many in the context of AI. And so, again, to me, that is self-evident. The arguments that this is different, every generation makes that argument because it's convenient, but it doesn't make it right.
A great place to end. I would agree with that, and I'm sure, however, the rest of the panel will amplify, agree, disagree. Jonathan, it would be great if you could stay on the line. I know that there are some questions for you already in the chat. You can, or in the Q&A, you can decide later if you can or want to answer. But for now, I want to thank you very much. It's always incredibly fun and educational talking to you. Thanks for coming today, and I'll hand over to Florian, who will master masterfully steer the panel around these issues of AI acquihires. Thanks again.
It's delightful. Thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you, Christina, with Florian, and this esteemed panel.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina and Jonathan. And thank you all for also attending. For those of you in the audience, as we already mentioned, today's panel explores AI acquihires. It's a fast-growing phenomenon where large technology firms acquire startups primarily for their talent rather than their products or technologies. As we've already heard, these deals raise fundamental questions at the intersection of competition, innovation, and labor markets. And I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel today that has expertise in all of these areas. In particular, I want to welcome our four panelists. They are Igor Letina, who is professor of microeconomics at the University of Bern. His research focuses on competition policy, innovation economics, and killer acquisition strategies in innovation. Like many of the other panelists today, he also wears another hat as a somewhat enforcer, as the vice president of the Swiss Competition Commission. And we also have Luis Garicano, who is a professor at the London School of Economics. Luis has done groundbreaking work on productivity, technological innovation, organization of work, inequality, public policy reform, a very, very broad set of contributions. Many of you may also know Luis in his role as a former politician. He served as a member of the European Parliament from 2019 to 2022. And before that time, he was also professor at Chicago Booth School of Business. We also have Ioana Marinescu, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a labor economist whose scholarship links labor economics, market power, monopsony, antitrust in labor markets, and again has extensive policy experience, having served as the principal economist at the US Department of Justice Antitrust Division. She was part of what I like to call the dream team of antitrust enforcement that included Jonathan Cantor and Susan Athey and many other great people that really drove the antitrust agenda in the US. And then finally, we also have Hans Sanger, who is the current head of unit in the chief economist team. Now, Hans isn't just an enforcer, but he's also written a number of really important contributions in academic journals. He has led the economic analysis in many high-profile mergers and antitrust investigations at DG Comp. And he's also the president of the Association of the Competition Economists. He's on that executive committee. So I'm delighted to have all of these folks here that have really varied expertise, both in the academic as well as the policy arena. And I want to start with Igor to get a first sense of saying, like, what is we really talking about? What are the definitions here, and what do people need to know about acquihires or AI acquihires in particular? So Jonathan has already made the case for why acquihires matter from an enforcement perspective. Igor, you've made some important academic contributions on acquihires as a competition problem. What's the risk to the markets when large firms buy teams mainly for talent? What's the theory? What's the evidence? What do we have? What do we know about this from an academic perspective?
Thank you, Florian. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me start off just by setting the stage and just defining what are we talking about, because there is some confusion about the terms. So I'm just going to enforce my own version of the terms. So first, an acquihire usually refers to a standard acquisition of a startup where the goal is mostly to collect the talented employees of that startup. And we've seen a number of such acquihires around the year 2010 in the tech sector. And sort of from the 2015, they have not been as common as in the years before. Now, what we're seeing today is slightly different. So starting around 2024, we are seeing what the newspapers are calling the reverse acquihire, which I think is a misnomer. I would call it a hidden acquihire. And this is characterized by the large tech companies buying almost exclusively AI startups, not buying, I'm sorry, I'm mistaking terms here. So what they seem to be doing is they are hiring the core team of talented employees from that startup, and they're at the same time engaging in very lucrative licensing deals with the remainder of that startup. Now, one way to interpret this is that what they're actually doing is they're just trying to skirt the rules, they're trying to skirt the regulation by not engaging in a formal acquisition. But the effects, as Jonathan was mentioning before, are exactly the same. So I would argue that these lucrative licensing deals are there mainly to make the investors in the startup satisfied and the remaining employees somewhat satisfied with the deals. The objective of these so-called reverse acquihires is exactly the same as standard acquihires. So we've seen, I have a list of 6 such acquihires from March 2024. The deals are from several $100 million to several $1 billion. So we're talking about huge sums of money. And I think it's worthwhile asking what are the effects. Now, I would like to make 2 points before handing over to the next panelist. So the first one is that such acquihires, and I'm including both the standard ones and the reverse acquihires, they're not necessarily different from startup acquisitions. So there's no reason to believe that an acquihire cannot at the same time also be a killer acquisition. Okay, so they can be 2 at the same time. And what that means is that everything that we have learned about the economics of startup acquisitions, their effects on competition and innovation, also applies to acquihires. So there are some general insights that we have, and we have a very rich literature by now that looks at these effects. The second point is that there are some effects which are specific to acquihires, and these effects all touch on labor issues. So if I can just very briefly run through some of the important effects, there's no way I can exhaustively summarize this literature in the time we have here, but just some important discussion points. So when we were discussing economics of startup acquisitions, one of the main counterpoint against stronger enforcement of merger regulation was that it would harm incentives to innovate. And in particular, it would harm incentives of startups to innovate. And that is a sound economic argument. Startups that sell do so because it is more profitable to them to sell than to compete, right? So this gives them an extra return on their intermediate success. Now, in your work, together with Colleen Cunningham and Song Ma, you have shown how this can have negative effects through the killer acquisitions channel, right? Incumbents can purchase such promising startups simply to kill them off. There are other reasons why we might also think why this incentive to innovate only to be bought out can be bad. It can move the direction of innovation towards less novel innovations. So there are papers looking at this. So I'm just going to give a few examples. Callender and Matuszek, and Dyke, Moraga, and Mochenkova. There's also some empirical evidence showing that innovation direction reacts to the opportunities to be acquired in Affeld and Kessler. There is a question of scaling of startups, right? So another reason why you might want to allow these acquisitions is because you think that the incumbents are better positioned to develop startups. That is also a sound economic argument, but there's a wonderful paper by Fumagalli, Motta, and Emanuele Tarantino that look at this problem and that show that despite this reason, there might still be a reason to intervene, and a good filtering mechanism could be the acquisition price. So they show that you might in particular want to look carefully at very expensive acquisitions. And then the final point is the one of the entrenchment of monopoly. So when we look at the literature showing negative innovation effects, so I have a paper with Regina Seibel and Armin Schmutzler that shows that this effect is there, but it might be very small, it might be non-existent, and there are industry characteristics we might want to look at. In addition, if you look at the more dynamic model, papers like the one by De Nicolo and Polo, but also Kevin Bryan and Eric Hovenkamp, they show that if you allow these acquisitions, what it can result in is a structure where the monopolist is so far ahead that nobody can compete anymore, and then the innovation incentive drops, right? So those are some reasons why we might want to enforce merger rules also against startup acquisitions in general, but against acquihires in particular. Now, just very briefly about more specific negative effects that pertain to acquihires, right? So in addition to those that pertain to startup acquisitions in general, there's a paper by Barisak, Noke, and Johnson that shows that acquihires can result in a higher monopsony power on the very specific labor market for these talented individuals. So that's one negative effect. And the second negative effect is talent hoarding. So I have a recent paper there with Jean-Michel Benkert and Shuo Liu, where we show how acquihires can lead to talent hoarding and all the negative things that come with talent hoarding. So I'm going to stop here and thank you for your time. I'm sure we're going to pick up some of these themes.
But I will take the opportunity to come back to you in a second. I think one thing that I do want to highlight is that this is an excellent overview of what the literature says. And correct me if I'm mistaken here, but it seems that a lot of the work that we have, both on the startup acquisitions and also on the acquihires, tends to be on the theoretical side. So I want to go back and partly also again to what Jonathan said, that we'd like to also be somewhat empirically informed. Do we have any sense yet from the literature of what the empirical magnitude for these things is?
So as I'm sure you're aware, empirically estimating these effects is very difficult. The number of empirical papers is much smaller than theoretical papers. I think, and most of the empirical literature that I'm familiar with, or the good papers, they're still waiting to be published, which also says something about economics and so some of the problems we have there structurally. So I would just like to point out two structural papers. So one would be the Affelt and Kessler one that I have already mentioned that show how acquisitions can influence the direction of innovation. And another one would be by Luise Eisfeld, which does show the potential for stricter regulation to have negative impact on innovation outcomes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to come back to this, and I will now use our second panelist, Luis Garicano. I'm going to try and exaggerate and try to set him up as our resident Chicago School economist and European politician. And in addition to the work that Luis has done also in both the politics and the academic arena, he now also writes a super fascinating Substack on Silicon Continent, where he's also argued for a somewhat more laissez-faire pro-AI innovation angle where the issue might be that regulation risks slowing the progress. Luis, how do you see acquihires? How do you see particularly these AI acquihires? Are they a natural feature of dynamic labor markets, or do we think that we need specific guardrails that maybe we haven't yet devised for this type of context before?
Thanks for bringing me for diversity. So I'll try to give some diversity. So I completely agree on competition as a good with Jonathan, and I also agree that we screwed up the social media big time. The fact that we allowed those huge switching costs to raise, etc. So those are my starting agreements, and also the idea that killer acquisitions do exist and do matter. Let me just start to make my more modest case for regulation to be a bit more modest by saying, yes, in Europe we voted a lot of things. I voted DMA and DSA and a lot of other things, and no, I don't think we are very happy with the outcome, and I don't think Europe on its own is able to impose a governance. I think we have to be careful. I think the car, I was furiously Googling what Jonathan was talking for the car example. The car example is interesting. The Mercedes was 1887, the Ford T is 1908. It took until the first traffic signal 1914, the two-way roads in the 1920s, the US standards 1935. I mean, you can look at all these things. It takes 2 decades after the invention of the car, and then the regulation comes over 2 decades for all these guardrails and 2 lanes, etc. I don't think in order to get AI to work, you need to anticipate as much as we did in Europe, and I think we probably regulated something that didn't exist. The AI Act came, the first reading, just to give people an anecdote of this, the first reading of the AI Act was closing when ChatGPT came in. People went into a massive panic. There was the February letter from Musk and others on the AI future of life saying that AI was going to kill us all. And 3 months later, the AI Act was approved. So you can imagine the atmosphere in Brussels when this happened. So now going specifically to the Acquihire, I disagree completely with the phrase, if the people are the assets, then hiring the people is the same as the merger. So when we hire, people have freedom. Slavery has been outlawed happily in most or all of our countries. We can't force people to move to a company, an asset, a database, a set of intellectual property you can buy and it cannot move away. People have the right to refuse an offer. We see superstar talent. I do agree with the comment about, hey, we can use prices. The truth is superstar talent does exist here. Is there a difference with how much Facebook pays when it does the acquihire than when it hires somebody from a hidden acquihire, to use I think the language is indeed better. Does it pay less when it does the hidden acquihire as when it hires somebody from XAI or from OpenAI? I'm not sure. I mean, these are $100 million. I don't think the price itself will signal that there are hidden nasty motives. So I do think superstar talent exists, and I do think that hiring that talent is important. I also think that things like windsurf are a negative consequence of our obsession with acquihires, because we say, oh, you can't do an acquihire. Then the company says, oh, well, too bad. Then we'll do this hidden acquihire where you just hire 6 guys and then let everybody else behind, which is actually not a good consequence of the regulation here. And innovation, which is something that I think is essential. It was touched upon indeed. Innovation is crucial. Exit is crucial for innovation. And I agree with that, with Igor, that we need to make sure that exit strategies exist. Just one last point on my view on this labor market. I haven't seen Igor's paper, and I need to see it. So I don't want to prejudge what I'll find there. But I am very doubtful that there is monopsony power in this high-end labor market, talent for labor market. There are an enormous amount of startups, an enormous amount of companies paying gigantic sums of money. I mean, these kids, I know some of these kids coming out of college. Some of them I've heard them earning many hundreds of thousands of dollars, going to all of these AI companies, going to all the finance companies, going to some of the biotech companies. This market for this superstar talent is pretty large and pretty liquid. And I don't think we're going to find evidence that they are actually trying to underpay these people. So that's my take. I think we need to look for evidence of hidden hidden attempts to violate merger rules, of course. And if the substance is that you're trying to violate the merger rules, then we definitely need to intervene, and that's the case of the killer acquisitions. I would be very careful with extending antitrust rules to the labor market for the reasons I just said.
Thank you, Luis. This is excellent. For those of you who are interested in particularly the theoretical arguments behind this issue of monopsony power in these acquihires, Igor already mentioned it. It's this paper by Heskey Isaac, Justin Johnson, and Volker Nocke. I would say I find the argument intriguing, and also the paper has won some prizes, but I am also somewhat skeptical that how specifically it applies in the AI acquihire setting. But we don't have, it's a good theoretical model. We don't yet know enough, I think, empirically about what this is. Let me go, since Luis has already set it up perfectly speaking about monopsony power. We have, of course, an expert on exactly monopsony power and issues of antitrust and competition policy in labor markets with us today in Ioana Marinescu, who has worn both hats as an enforcer and as a labor economist talking about these issues. Ioana, do you see acquihires as potentially unfairly restricting mobility, or are they just another form of competitive hiring? What do we know about worker welfare, spillovers, knowledge diffusion, or whether innovation overall suffers or thrives because of these? Do we have any parallels also, maybe, since Luis already said we have done some work in the past on labor market antitrust issues, like, can we draw any lessons from those experiences to the present context of AI acquihires?
Absolutely. So I think this is a really interesting, novel way of doing acquisitions. I mean, you could call that. So, if we start with how Jonathan Cantor was presenting it, he said these reverse acquihires are a merger but in name. And I think there are some subtleties. If I want to play the devil's advocate, I will say that the startup whose employees who are hired away is still there, presumably still with some employees. So it's not quite the same as like removing a company. However, the question is, how easy would it be for that remaining company to replace the CEO? And I think that can be a really tall order, such that the company in question might end up flailing or failing, due to this difficulty of replacing the CEO. Thereby, once it does fail, if it goes this far, and even if it doesn't but merely flails, it's no longer an effective competitor, whether in the product market, whatever the product was, or in the labor market, as far as hiring workers in the tech sector. And indeed, as Igor was mentioning, and given your own work, Florian, to the degree that the startup dies, the effect can be very similar to a killer acquisition, the practical effect in terms of removing that threat to competition from the point of view of the bigger company who's taking this move. And so, there is actually some related work on this in terms of trying to understand how important CEOs are. And there's in particular a nice paper by Shi in Econometrica, which is a structural model. So there's empirical data with a model and showing that non-competes for executives are really harmful to other firms that try to hire. So there is really an issue around the ability of especially startups to hire good CEOs so that they can be competitive in this market. So in that sense, there is, this is something to consider, what happens when we remove the CEO from the company, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the discussion, but I'm pointing out that that's an issue. But for now, this being said, I want to proceed here in my remarks saying, like, okay, let's just for a moment assume that an acquihire is kind of like a merger, even though I just said it's not quite the same thing, but it's similar. And so in that sense, what do we know about how mergers affect competition in the labor market? And actually here I need to make another quick aside. There's actually there's an interesting paper about non-competes in the tech industry, and looking at that and showing that these non-competes actually reduced wages. Thereby, there can actually be monopsony issues in the tech industry. That's one example how it could happen. But now, if I just zoom out and ask, well, what's the effect of mergers on competition for labor? There's a big literature on that. Now that I summarize in my review of the literature with Jose Azar, but essentially mergers that greatly reduce competition for labor tend to reduce wages. And so that's a big reason why in my tenure at the DOJ, working with Jonathan, we've been working on enforcing against anti-competitive behavior in the labor market, including by updating the merger guidelines to make it clear that the antitrust authorities will go after mergers that significantly reduce competition in the labor market. So I think that that's something that is well known, that generally speaking, and again, this is based on mergers across many industries, mergers, again, that have the effect of significantly reducing competition tend to reduce wages.
Now, I want to go back and talk a little bit, since we do know a few things about, the labor market impacts in big tech, and I think that you alluded already to it, is there's this issue that one of the most high-profile cases that we had there was actually exactly the reverse of hiring away, which was not to actually basically have a no cold call list of not allowing firms to hire from each other, which we tend to think actually had terrible outcomes for some of the workers that could not get hired by other tech firms, and potentially also had some impact on the innovation that was being possible. And so I think it's an issue here, really. Yeah.
I'm sorry, if I could just because I said careful with labor, absolutely agreed on that completely, right? That's kind of price fixing in another way. So I would totally agree on enforcing the no poaching, the wage fixing things, barring non-competes on all these transactions, notifications important, and also getting the talent supply from abroad, which we're now cutting, which gets competition. So I would totally agree that the kind of things that Joanna has been talking about are completely to be pursued. That's coming on the kind of traditional antitrust. Like, okay, we make a deal and we say we're not going to poach each other. That's like, okay, obviously illegal. I think the subtle issue is the one where we are not allowed, exactly as you said, the opposite side, to actually hire and pay more, etc. That's like, okay, wait a second.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that is indeed a potential tension here for sure. I think the question becomes, whether the transaction can, or the action can really be described as a reverse acquihire. Because, for example, let's say they're just hiring the CEO. There's no licensing deal, nothing else. Maybe they're, okay, I mean, it's kind of bad for the startup, but, but then if they're hiring, I don't know, again, this can be hard to regulate, like X% of the workforce and are, getting all of the IP or, whatever, 70% of the IP, I'm starting to have some questions about what this is about. Is this really about because why is it that all the workers in this company are the best workers I want to hire right now? I mean, as we have said, the market is actually quite broad. There's people in many other companies. So it becomes a little bit, shall we say, suspicious, when it takes certain form. But where do you draw the line? I mean, that's a complicated matter. So I want to distinguish hiring one person and sort of what we're talking about here.
So if Chelsea wants to buy Bradford's coach and coaching team because they're doing great and the team is really outstanding and doing great, you're going to tell Chelsea, sorry, you're going to make Bradford much worse, so we don't let you buy it?
For all of you who are not London residents, Brentford and Chelsea are two soccer teams, and that's an excellent comparison, and one that I greatly approve of in terms of an analogy. Let me move on to Hans, who's led as the chief economist at DG Competition. You've been at the center of many of these high-profile merger and antitrust cases in Europe. From your vantage point, how should we think about these acquihires maybe now in the European context? Are they already on the radar of DG Comp? Now, I understand you might not be allowed to say the stuff about current ongoing cases, but how do you see the main challenges of assessing these types of acquisitions with current tools?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the invite. I speak for myself, and I speak COVID infected, so if I say something stupid, it's probably my fever hallucination. I think it's important to clarify at the beginning that really when we talk about acquihires, in an antitrust sense, this is not about hiring, one team out of a company or, 10 people, but the actual cases that present themselves are essentially situations where a dominant tech company hires, 95% or more of the employees and acquires essentially all of the IP and leaves behind it an empty shell. So, one case that was substantial was Microsoft Inflection, and in that case, Microsoft hired every single worker. No, didn't hire. They made an offer to every single worker of Inflection except one, and that one person also didn't remain with Inflection in the end. Plus, they got a license to all the technology. So I think the slavery analogy in terms of if Antitrust has the right to supervise these cases, it would somehow go against the basic freedoms of people who are to work. I'm really not sure that that really applies. Now, in terms of the the real obstacles or not of looking at these mergers, I think this question of what is a concentration has a long legal historic tradition, and it's something that lawyers love because it used to be extremely form-based. Some countries have 25% threshold for control, others 50%, and then lawyers can write 400-page dissertations about the specific circumstances when you box this thing here or there. And I think in all this discussion gets completely lost what is the actual effect. And certainly for our part, for the Commission, we will have an effects-based look at this. And that's, I think, where I would agree with Jonathan. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then probably it should also be legally classified as a duck. What the defendants in such cases usually bring against these types of more sort of reality-based assessments is that they say there's no legal certainty because it's much better if you have these very specific pointers. But of course, what that means is a very strange view of legal certainty, namely one where, first of all, we're taking just only the perspective of the potential perpetrator and never the perspective of the potential victim, which would be society if there's a killer acquisition or something like this. And second of all, it cannot be the idea of the law to put lots of static formalistic goalposts somewhere and then to just give firms an opportunity to slalom around them in the most efficient way to undermine the intention of the law. I think at the end of the day, the biggest legal certainty we'll have is that if a CEO thinks, well, I really will control that target in every essential sense that is relevant for business for me, then probably the law will apply to me as well. Now, going to substance a bit. I mean, I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I want to zoom out a little bit because I think it's important to have a look at, do we have a problem in AI already? If so, where is it? Are it Acquihires? Is it something else? I think it's fair to note at the beginning that still, this is an extraordinarily dynamic place with, where we have 10 or so really very well-funded contenders, and so it's not only a dynamic place, but at the moment also a very competitive place. At the same time, of course, what we're seeing is these myriads of co-investments and partnerships, and it's a little bit of a swingers club lately. I mean, it's like everybody is with. I think it's impossible in a 2D diagram to still draw all the connections. You need additional dimensions. And of course, what has crystallized is that the big tech tend to be among the strongest surprise players in AI. Now, from my perspective, from an authority, I think the most important thing in this market, is simply to ensure that this competitive process will lead to a situation where the wholesale market, the wholesale access to the foundation models is open. Yeah, I mean, if we're at the end in a situation where Alphabet, is very well funded and has great AI, and Amazon does, and maybe takes over Anthropic and so forth, that's not going to help us. I mean, obviously we want a competitive marketplace where disruption is happening not only by new business model of the big techs, but also by startups that precisely because there is AI have the opportunity to challenge business models that could not be challenged in the 20 years before because of network effects, scale effects, and so forth. And for that, having sort of an open merchant market is critical. Now, at the moment we have that. Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, if you want access, you can have it from so many different players at a reasonable price. But I think that's for me the greatest attention that I would pay. Now, when I was asked a year ago, and in AI times, that's feels like an eternity now. What do I think? Where is this going? I said, I don't know, but if history is any guide, then we'll probably see some supply glut and overinvestment bubble, and then afterwards consolidation and monetization. And because that's a little bit how many of the revolutionary industries have gone. Automobiles was named before. There were 200 car manufacturers in the US, more than 80 in Germany. And similar cycles of overinvestment in physical infrastructure. You had in railways, you had an internet connectivity 25 years ago. Now OpenAI alone is planning $1 trillion of investment in data centers, funded by SoftBank. That's the people who bought lots of tech stocks in 2000 and who invested in WeWork and Wirecard at the top of their valuation. So, I mean, it awfully looks like a bubble in terms of the investment. Now, what does that mean for competition? Nothing bad as such. Obviously these investments are great. They're great for consumers, and they're perhaps not great for the environment, but certainly all these past overinvestments, they have been fantastic as well, because then for many years, essentially society can live off them. I mean, in terms of the competition, what people sometimes forget is the question about market power here is not only or mainly whether this is a great technology. I mean, obviously it is, and we're at the beginning of it all, but the question is whether firms will be in a position to differentiate themselves in a way that allows monetization to a degree that's worrisome for society. And now, I mean, we don't know yet how this will evolve, and that's quite natural. When Google and Facebook started out, they didn't have much of a viable idea how to monetize either, and then they stumbled into advertising and realized they had hit a gold mine. So this is obviously all developing. It's just that I'm wondering, if I'm looking at where the foundation models are today, and I look at the output of ChatGPT versus Gemini or Claude or whatever, I'm not sure that these models, as they stand, have so much differentiation that you can already think about huge markups being put on them. And that $1 trillion of investment in data centers, that will have to be covered by someone, and I think it's not going to be the 22 euros I pay for my ChatGPT subscription. So when I'm looking at competitive risks, I will finish in a second, Florian. If I look at competitive risks, besides sort of the killer acquisitions, I think a second thing that I would worry about is what happened in these overinvestment cycles in the past. So we know 150 years ago, 120 years ago in the US, that's when the big trusts were formed. And of course, the moment you had the trusts that allowed coordinating the big players have common representatives. On the one hand, you had essentially a merger like market power, this collusion, and high prices. And on the other hand, what you had was essentially collective foreclosure, because you had the big guys and they could collectively make sure that nobody else can use their networks, which third-party access was needed, much in the same way that a small new platform may need access to foundation models by one of the big guys. So I would look beyond the merger aspect of the killer acquisition, certainly also, at all these cross-linking investments right now and what they mean in terms of, the risk that that the people who may dominate the space, and there's not going to be 10, 15 players in 10 years likely, yeah. So if we have in the end 5, 6 really, really big players, they may all have very congruent interests in terms of, not wanting smaller players to disrupt them, wanting to monetize, and being very happy in a siloed world where wholesale access is limited. So I would really be concerned about that in addition to killer acquisitions. Thank you.
So I want to throw back and allow our any of our panelists to respond to this. Otherwise, I would progress with this and just throw this back to Hans and ask, do we, having lived through maybe our failures of the early 2010s, where we didn't do preventative antitrust or didn't do preventative competition policy, where we sort of waited to see how it plays out, are we bound to repeat the same mistakes here, or do you think that there's here much more of an understanding now that, well, we will be able to intervene when actually the competitive harms occur?
Well, I think Lewis is absolutely right when he says regulation is hard, right? So I was always shocked when commissioners of the commission would go out and would say, we now have the solution in regulation for all the platform companies. It's sort of preventing self-preferencing. Yeah. And I was thinking, man, platform businesses of a simpler sort, we also had 150 years ago, electricity or railways or whatever has been regulated, since ages. And, it was very, very hard, to adapt that regulation to something that reasonably works. And I think nobody who looks at railway regulation today would say, oh, railway markets, they're so great. Everything works so wonderfully, especially in my home country, Germany. So, the best that you can say is like, well, after having adapted regulation in a very piecemeal, long process, by now it's kind of okay. I think everybody agrees that it needs to be regulated, but regulation is tough, So I don't want to make any predictions of us being sort of well equipped for this or anything of the sort, but is tough. At the same time, I also think, just because something is tough doesn't mean that you should open all the floodgates and say, well, if regulation is not easy, then just let them do whatever they want. I think we are better prepared in one sense, and that sense is that at the time when there were decisions like Google DoubleClick, yeah. I don't think the people discussing the case. There's some pretty intelligent discussions of the problems that we later saw. Yeah, it's not that they didn't, that they were too stupid to understand the potential problem. So given how old this decision is, actually the discussion is not so bad. The problem is that I think at the time the feeling prevailed, oh no, that's such a developing market, let's not do anything against essentially two firms with very strong market power merging, and I think that mistake we will not do again, so as regulators generally, I don't mean the commission specifically. Having said that, it's a very fast developing pace, and I don't think it's good for regulators to sort of predict technological change. So let's see. We'll have to do our best.
Luis.
Yes. No. I wanted to first say that I completely agree with the position of Hans, that the absolute huge priority for Europe, and I think for the US, is to make sure that the foundation model layer remains competitive. If the foundation model layer ends up where Facebook and company ended, we are in big trouble, because they will be able to extract essentially all the surplus from every European company and consumer, and will be in some serious trouble. So I think that single-minded focus is very good. I wanted to kind of answer a bit your question, Florian, whether we went late and maybe we're at risk of going late. So my view on what we screwed up. So let me just give you my example with Twitter, right? So I don't like the owner of Twitter, and I won't use his preferred word for this either. And it turns out I have 105,000 or something like that, like you do, Florian, followers there. And so I'm kind of stuck, right? So imagine a world where I could tweet and people could follow me from Threads, from Twitter, from Facebook, from whatever. They could just see, oh, I'm a follower of this fellow and I follow him in whatever platform I am. So that's a world where these things remain really interoperable and where I am the owner of my own followers. Then I would have obviously quitted this long ago, but I can't, right? So what is critical here, and we did well with the regulation of fintech by forcing the banks to give consent to consumers so they could move their data and use that data with a new financial entrance, is to ensure that the switching costs are not introduced by the foundation models, that if it starts to have a memory and remember the interactions with me and starts to know about myself, and that's the moment where the switching cost is built, that I have the right at any time to say, all of these memories are mine, and now I want to move them to somewhere else. So the idea of preserving this kind of semi-oligopolistic 10 competitors, something like that, trying to keep that foundation layer competitive and not allowing, unlike we did before, the introduction of those switching costs, I think that is the single-minded priority. Of course, antitrust mergers would be one way around that, so that would be a corollary.
Christina.
Thank you. It's difficult to just sit back and listen to this interesting discussion and not to just itch to say something, because everyone here is saying stuff that is super interesting. But I couldn't help myself to jump in and comment and pursue perhaps a little bit what Hans said. Again, I always enjoy what you say, Hans. I think you're great, and I love what you say in every situation. But here, what you are sort of essentially laying bare is the fact that, yes, regulators, and not just the Commission, are aware of the potential anxiety, of the actual anxiety that exists. I mean, Jonathan laid it out very clearly about essentially missing the boat completely, right? Because there is a narrative, as we touched upon, which is very persistent, and it's a narrative that says, oh, but AI is different. I see this the whole time. There is a number of reports and things, of course, paid by the industry that says, oh, but this has nothing to do with the economics of the tech platforms of yesterday. This has got not the same network effects. It's a hugely competitive market, so we should not expect the same kind of outturns. And yet you're in a world in which certainly at the foundation level, you need sort of forests of GPUs, you need effectively tons of compute, you need tons of money, and the rest, you can suck it up because it isn't widely available. So that is something we see and we are aware of. At the same time, and I understand the predicament. What we see is competition agencies, and I don't mean just the Commission, the CMA, others, looking at this kind of deals, and in the end, backing off, because it's uncertain, because we really can't do very much, because it's so, there isn't really something that we can do. And I'm not sort of arguing that it should be different, but I'm just saying I don't buy for a second the narrative from the consultants out there, which is incredibly shallow, that this is different. And yet I can see that it's difficult to just come to a landing. So we're all aware of a risk, but we don't know exactly what to do about it at this point in time. And that's not an enviable position to be in, I guess.
Hans, do you want to respond? You're mute.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, just very quickly. So, indeed, the scale economy is potentially involved. I mean, that is certainly going to be something that we will see the repercussions of as we go along. Now, in terms of what to do about it, of course, there's also a question, sort of, what do we actually mean? Do we mean, only merger control, or do we mean other measures? In terms of merger control, I think to the extent that we can legally deal with these cases, and there may be certain difficulties here or there because of thresholds and the like, but by and large, we can deal with those cases, and of course we will, to the extent that one has a concrete competition story. But I think that's also the difference between, let's say, Igor can write a paper and can say, look, there's sort of a spillover, and in principle it's not so great, even if there's no competition problem. But of course, you cannot bring a merger with merger control on that basis. You may be able to use other policy tools, in terms of sponsoring independent innovation and so forth and so forth. You can do industrial policy of kinds, but I think right now I also frankly haven't seen sort of the AI merger that that was in any way obviously toxic. I mean, we had a few that we looked at, and and in those cases, believe me, we looked very hard. We looked a lot more than people might think is appropriate for deals of the size otherwise. So, which is not to say there's nothing to see. It's just to say that at least my desk, I haven't seen much that got my eyebrows high. I mean, the tech deals that were problematic for us were much more things like Adobe Figma, which was undermining innovation competition, and where now, like a year and a half or whatever after we said we would prohibit, Figma has actually done an IPO and has actually entered in precisely the market that we and other agencies had alleged they would enter.
Yeah, Igor, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I'm really happy that you mentioned the Adobe Figma case. I think that is important in one particular way. I agree definitely with Louis that these reverse acquihires are probably a response to the posture by the regulators, and I think that's the reality of life. Whatever regulators do, the firms will try to find a way around it. And I agree with Hans that we cannot just say regulation is difficult and therefore we do nothing. The thing that I would like to point out, Florian, you have a very nice short paper that I like very much with Bruno Pellegrino that looks at the number of IPOs relative to the number of acquisitions. So I would encourage everybody to take a look. It's very short, and what you show very nicely.
It only has one nice big graph.
That's one nice big graph
need to know, yeah.
That shows that in the last 20 years, the number of acquisitions relative to the number of IPOs has exploded, right? And now we are sitting here and we're talking about, isn't it wonderful that Figma went public and it was so successful? So the question is, can we do something to encourage more of the startups to go to the IPO route as opposed to just trying to be acquired? And here I would really like to encourage everybody to think also a little bit outside of our competition box, to think about other policy tools. Can we make IPOs easier? Can we make them faster? Can we maybe introduce some kind of an acquisition tax that would make it more difficult for firms to take over startups? So lots of things that it's easy to just throw out ideas, but I really do think that we have a systematic problem with this lack of IPOs and with most startups just going for the sales to one of the oligopolistic firms.
Yeah, and excellent point, because it really sets me up for what might be my last question, which is to the entire round, which is we're mostly all competition policy experts or antitrust experts, with the exception of Luis, who's of course dabbled in a wider arena. Is there any role for industrial policy or fiscal policy or other things specifically in the European context that we can employ here, or that we should think about? Is there something that allows particularly European companies or European startups to be better positioned in this case here?
So I've been arguing for what I've been calling a smart second mover strategy. So I'm going to write more about it. I wrote a blog about it. And the smart second mover is, let's forget about the hardware. We're probably gone. Let's do our best to win the implementation battle, which means let's get the data advantage of our health companies. Let's get the data advantage of our manufacturing companies. Let's leverage that. Let's leverage our big consumer market. Let's do our best to keep, I mean, this is essential for the whole strategy, to keep the foundation model layer competitive and work hard, like with whatever tools we need in order to ensure that interoperability and that ability to move and that limited switching cost. And use our money not to build data centers. I think that's a huge mistake. I don't think that's going to be that's going to allow us. It's probably too late for the infrastructure battle. And not to build foundation models. I mean, I was amused when all the European press was congratulating itself on the 1.7 billion investment by ASML and Mistral, when we're talking about 80 billion Amazon buildup of AI and numbers like that. So I think that's tricky. On the other hand, we have a big battle to win and to give by being the best at implementation. We have good data, good good manufacturers, and we can use our tools to be the smartest second movers. But we need to be speedy, which we are now the opposite. We need to be smart in terms of not putting sticks in the tires of all our companies. And I think we could succeed. I mean, we could have that layer of Booking.coms and SAPs. Not that I'm happy with Booking's monopoly position, okay? Neither with SAPs, but that layer of companies that are able to, the hospitals, the pharmas, the manufacturers are able to use the AI and be the best at that.
Christina, go ahead.
Ahead, Luis, because this is where somewhat we disagree. I think we should not adopt a narrative that says it's too late for hardware and Europe is lost. I think the European Commission shouldn't be doing random things, investing in random things like the AI factories that no one understands and wants. But that's the prerogative of the Commission to do crazy stuff and send money helicopter style into random endeavors. I think there is.
Well, it is something that also the US administration is currently doing by buying stakes in various.
I'm sure it's
companies.
true,
Yeah.
but all I'll say briefly is that there is still appetite in the private sector for building data center. There are data centers being built, and if they can find the money to fund their data center, more power to you. I don't want
Absolutely.
taxpayer money going there because
100%.
I don't think it's a good. But if the private sector can do it, just go ahead. And I don't think we should give up on that fight. So I differ a little bit. So that's the sort of the slight wrinkle I wanted to put.
I was just on the industrial policy part, but I completely agree on the private sector. Whatever people want to do, please go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, the only thing that the public sector needs to do is bloody buy things. Because if they don't buy from European sources, then of course there is a source of demand, we're sending money abroad. That's also an important aspect.
Yeah. Any of our other panelists, I want to give them also an opportunity to maybe weigh in here. Hans, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just a small correction. I mean, I think when you see these big industrial policy investments and these great ideas like setting up shop with Intel in Germany, it's really the member states who have these fantastic ideas. We're just rubber stamping them at the end of the day. Now, I wanted to get back to something that Igor has said about the capital markets. And there, I really agree because, I mean, obviously we have a dismal tech scene compared to the US, and that has a lot of reasons. Now in the public consultation on our new merger guidelines, sort of the European startups, they say a lot, please don't go against killer acquisitions and the like, because, it will undermine the investment, blah, blah, blah. But, just to say, I don't think I can't recall that we've ever done any case against any European startup. This is just, this is not the reason why we don't have the right capital markets. The reasons are others and are complicated. And I think That's sort of a regulatory endeavor that goes far beyond the competition field, obviously, and we have extremely fragmented capital markets, often with countries also being happy to control what's in their sphere, and of course also some of the actors being very happy for it to be fragmented market, and that's not so dissimilar to other industries, telecoms, or for example, or airlines. I mean, people always say, oh, we have 25 telcos and 30 airlines. In the US there's only 4 or 5, and that's true. But if you go with an airline from Chicago to New York, you can use all of those carriers and probably 2 or 3 low-cost carriers on top, because all of these guys span the entire US. Whereas, if you go from Brussels to Munich or to Frankfurt or to Vienna or to Zurich or to Rome, these are monopolies. So we have lots of operators, but everybody in their own little small cocoon. And so I think there's really not enough effort being made in order to really create European markets, especially on the finance side, and to provide a framework that makes it more attractive for financing startups in Europe. And I very much hope that politicians will make some progress on that in the next years.
Good. Well, I think we are, unless I have another somebody chiming in from our panel, I will conclude essentially here. We've had fantastic contributions here, really wide stuff. I'll give Tommaso maybe the last word for announcements of what we're going to do with the Research Policy Network still. But this was a wonderful panel. I thank all of our panelists, and also Jonathan Cantor for taking the time to do the fireside chat with us. I hope you will be back, and I'll leave the word for Tommaso for the closing.
I just want to thank everybody. It's been, I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot, and it was great to have a different perspective on this topic. I think somehow we are ignoring a little bit the political aspect of it. So when we talk about AI, we talk about Sam Altman, we talk about these guys that when they come to Europe, there is red carpets in front of them, and they're meeting our prime ministers, and the discussion is a bit different, I guess. But it's all of this will be recorded and will be posted online. The next meeting of our network will be in person in Paris for a big CEPR conference. If you are in Paris in early December, please do join. And I shall thank everybody, and in particular CEPR once again for hosting us. Thank you very much, everybody.